Clock in the back says it is 7 p.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone. Oh, there's a bell. Sweet. So we'd like to first, begin by welcoming everyone to our midweek Bible study. If you're visiting with us, we'd like to welcome you. I also like to let you know that I'm not the normal teacher. Michael Clark is away right now on travel, and he asked me to fill in for him this evening, and I'm excited and thankful for the opportunity, and Lord willing, he will be back next week to pick up where he left off last week. As you can tell by the PowerPoint behind me, that we're going to talk about this evening the incarnation of Jesus, or the incarnation of the Word. It is something that I think the world, possibly religion, and I say that just in a general sense, may not really take as seriously as it deserves. It's an interesting study. I actually had to write about it in school. Really enjoyed the study and decided to turn it into a Bible class to teach, mainly for my own fulfillment, but hopefully through the study of this topic, we can at the very least fortify our faith and maybe learn something new as we go along. Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, "But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman." And essentially what Paul's saying is that when the time was right, God sent deity, the second member of the Godhead, into this world, and he served a purpose. And so that's what we're going to study this evening. When we think about the incarnation, talking about Jesus, one thing we'll notice is that if we read the Old Testament, we're going to find that the incarnation, or Jesus coming to this earth in physical form, has been talked about throughout the entire Old Testament. We open our Bibles to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. This is the first messianic prophecy in the Bible. This is the first prophecy written about Jesus, and entailed in this prophecy are the bookends of Christ's time here on earth. It says, "And I will put enmity." God is talking to Satan after Adam and Eve had fallen, after they had sinned against his one command not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And he starts to dole out punishments, and he's talking to Satan. And he says, "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. And thou shalt bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." So in this one messianic prophecy, we have, like I said, the bookends of Christ's incarnation. The first is seen in that phrase, "her seed." That is a reference to the virgin birth. Anytime we read throughout the Bible and we start reading about seed lines, the seed is always attributed to the male or to the man. That's biology 101. The male provides the seed, the woman provides the egg. When the two meet, you have a child that is born, or that starts the process of being born. But in this particular verse, the seed is attributed to Christ. It's the only time in history that the seed will be attributed, the seed's attributed to a woman. It's the only time in history that a seed will be attributed to a woman. It's the only time in the Bible that you will see the seed attributed to a woman. And that's because Christ's birth is unique. There's nothing like it. No one else was born in the same manner in which Christ was. If you'd like to mark in your Bibles, you can underline that phrase, "her seed." And you could put Matthew chapter 1 and verse 18. I think that's kind of small. But it says, "Now the birth of Jesus was on the wise, when as his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Ghost." So the first messianic prophecy in the book of Genesis starts off with the birth of Jesus, his coming into this world in physical form. The next phrase, or the bookend, would be the latter end of his life, and that would represent his death, or the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Those phrases, "bruise thy head," that's a reference to the resurrection of Jesus. "Shalt bruise his heel," that's a reference to the crucifixion of Jesus. And again, if you like to mark in your Bibles, you can underline those verses and put Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14, where it says, "For then as the children are partakers of the flesh and blood, he also, talking about Christ, himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil. So here in the first Mesopotamia, we see the birth of Jesus and the death and the resurrection of Jesus represented in the very first thing said about Jesus in the Old Testament. Another reference to the incarnation of Jesus is found in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. There it says, "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin," talking about Mary, "shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Now what's interesting is we look at the Hebrew and the Greek words for that word virgin. And the reason we bring this up is because it's very blatant. This applies only to Christ, and it's a prophecy about the virgin birth. What's interesting and sometimes disappointing is that there's some who will translate that word virgin as young woman. The Hebrew word itself can be translated as virgin or young woman, so some will try to translate it in the young woman sense. The motivation behind that is they like to deny the deistic side of Christ. The Hebrew word is Alma. It's used 7 times in the Old Testament, and every time that it's used, it is used to imply a woman who has not known a man, and a woman who doesn't have the opportunity by traditional senses to become pregnant. Then we go over to the Greek word. The Greek word is parenthos, and it can only mean virgin in the New Testament. Now the reason that's important is when we go over to Matthew chapter 1 and verse 23, Matthew will actually quote Isaiah 7:14, and he will use the word parenthos in that place. Also, what else is interesting is in the Septuagint, when they translated Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14, they used the Greek word parenthos as well. The word, again, can only mean virgin. Therefore, Matthew, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, understood the words of Isaiah to mean a virgin. The Septuagint, with all their knowledge, very skilled translators, Christ would actually quote from the Septuagint, which lets us know that it's a valid source, would also use the word as well. So there shouldn't be any type of controversy around this word, but there is. But from a just simply translating point, the evidence points to a virgin, and again, a miraculous birth of Jesus. There's more throughout the Bible. We don't have time to spend a whole lot of time looking at each of them, but Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6 talks about the virgin birth. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 3 talks about John the Baptist, a human here on earth, preparing a way for the Messiah. So that's the indication of the physical nature of God coming to this earth. Jeremiah chapter 23 verses 5 and 6 deal with that as well. So throughout the Old Testament, from a prophecy standpoint, Jesus, or the second member of the Godhead, coming into this earth in physical form was talked about quite a bit. However, this is not the only time that we see deity in a physical form. Throughout the Old Testament, we're going to see God come to this earth in physical form. That is known as theophany. Theophany is a visible manifestation of God, a self-disclosure of deity. There are a few examples of deity. Probably the most well-known example of deity is found in theophany is found in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 2 when we read about the burning bush. That is an example of theophany. God came in the form of a bush that was on fire but was not burning. The bush itself wasn't burning, and he spoke to Moses. Moses had a conversation with God. The commander of the Lord's army in Joshua chapter 5 verse 13. Man approaches with his sword drawn. Joshua goes out to talk to him. He asks, "Are you for us or against us?" He essentially says that I'm the commander or the captain of the host of the army of God. And then Joshua bows down and he worships this individual. This individual then tells him to take off his shoes, so he accepts the worship from Joshua. It's not a man of God, because if we go to Acts chapter 10, when Cornelius bows down to worship Peter, Peter tells him to get up because he's simply a man like he is, and he's not worthy of worship. We can go to the book of Revelation, and we can read about how John bowed down to an angel, and the angel told him the same thing, get up because I'm a servant just like you are. So a man of God and an angel working for God are not going to accept worship because not worthy of worship. But in Joshua chapter 5, this man does accept the worship of Joshua. And so we can reach the logical conclusion that this is the second member of the Godhead who we know as Christ. Another example is found in Genesis chapter 32, when we can read about Jacob wrestling with an angel. We know that this is God. You go over to Hosea chapter 12, and we start reading in verse 3. It says, He took his brother by the heel in the womb. So we know we're talking about Jacob. And it says, and by his strength he had power with God. So in Genesis chapter 32, we know that that man that Jacob wrestled with was deity, because Hosea confirms that for us in Hosea chapter 12 and verse 3. So those are instances or examples, and there are many more throughout the Bible of theophany, of God coming down in human form and conversing with humanity and to some degree. Now let's compare theophany and incarnation. There's a big difference between these two. First, let's list what's in common. The commonality between these two phrases, essentially we have a physical manifestation of God here on earth. That applies to theophany. That also applies to the incarnation of Jesus. As far as common characteristics between these two terms, that's essentially where it ends. That's the only thing these two things have in common. Now, from a different standpoint, we see that one, theophany, is temporary. In other words, God came down to this earth in human form. He served whatever purpose he had here on earth, and then he went back up into heaven. The opposite of incarnation, or the opposite characteristic of incarnation, is that it was permanent. John chapter 1 verse 14, it says, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. That word dwelt in this particular word has involved with it the idea of taking up residence or pitching a tent. Now, over the Christmas holiday, Carly and I went on a vacation to Scottsdale, Arizona. We made the plans to go for 6 days. One thing we did not do when we arrived in Scottsdale, Arizona, is change the address on our driver's license. We didn't have our mail forwarded. We didn't enroll our children in school. We didn't bring vehicles or furniture or anything like that, because we understood that our time in Scottsdale was temporary. We knew we'd be there, serve whatever purpose it was, and then come back. Now, almost 2 years, about 18 months ago, in June of 2020, when we decided to come to school, we loaded up a U-Haul. We moved here. We changed our address. We forwarded all our mail. We had to call the credit card companies and the banking industries and all that. We enrolled our children in school. We moved here. We took up residence. We understood at that time, in the next 2 years, we would be citizens of Memphis, Tennessee, and we went about our lives as if we were the ones who lived in Tennessee. And that's the difference between theophany and the incarnation. The theophany is like a vacation. It's temporary, goes back up. Incarnation, Christ was going to stay here for a little bit. He was going to live here. He was going to take up residence here on the earth. As you can see, another characteristic of theophany is that when God appeared to man, God appeared in a fully mature form. So we take the burning bush, for example. God came as a full-grown, mature bush. You didn't have to, God didn't put a seed into the ground, and that seed didn't grow up and eventually have a conversation with Moses. God came. He came in the fullness of as a full, mature bush, and then he spoke with Moses. The commander of the Lord's army came down as a fully mature man, served his purpose, went up. Same thing with the angel that wrestled with Jacob. From a incarnation perspective, it's different. Luke chapter 2 and verse 52 says, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature physically, and in favor with God and man." So when we consider the birth of Jesus, the one thing we kind of have to understand is that the conception of Jesus is the only difference between our birth and his birth. The miraculous conception. In other words, everyone in here has a mother and a father, and we can claim that we came into this earth because we have a physical father and a physical mother that gave birth to us. Jesus, on the other hand, has no physical father here on earth. No man, Joseph, his stepfather, for lack of a better term, contributed in no way of conceiving Jesus. But after that, after the conception of Jesus, he develops in the same fashion that you and I did. In other words, he after he was conceived, he grew within Mary for 9 months. He was born into this world the same way that most of us normally, if you're born normally, we came into this world. He was a newborn. He was a toddler. He was a young child. He was a teenager, and then he eventually went into a man, and he matured that way. That's what Luke chapter 2 and verse 52 is in reference to. So outside of the conception, he grew just as we did. And so if you're over the age of about 33, 34 years old, you have essentially developed in the same exact way Christ has. And so that's a characteristic of incarnation that separates it from theophany. So understanding that, now we want to take a few moments and just look at why. And this is going to be the meat of the class this evening, because there's a purpose for the incarnation. There are things that we have to understand about it and the purpose behind it. John chapter 1 and verse 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So we see three characteristics about Jesus, or the deistic side of Jesus. One, he's eternal in nature. Two, that he is separate from God the Father. That phrase, "and the Word was with God," has the idea of two individuals looking at each other. So this isn't just God the Father in a different form. This is an actual separate personality of the Godhead. And three, the Word was God. In other words, he's worthy of as much honor and glory. He shares the same character as God the Father. So anytime we talk about God, for the remainder of this class, we want to apply this to the deistic side of Jesus. Because we can. Anything we say about the Father, we can say the same exact thing about the Son, because they're the same. So a few reasons why Jesus had to come in incarnate form. Number one, he had to be tempted. James chapter 1 and verse 13 says, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man." All right, so there's a necessity. Jesus, in his deistic form, cannot be tempted. Go to Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 17. "Wherefore in all things it behoved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make a reconciliation for the sins of the people." This example, or this comparison, has been made before in concerning Christ, but it's a great example. If you look at the way the business world works today, most companies, most large companies, have a union. And that union has is essentially a group of workers, and then apart from that union, you have management. And at times, they'll start to butt heads. The union doesn't feel that the management is understanding or seeing the problems from their perspective. Management doesn't feel like the union is seeing the problems or the issues with the company from their perspective, and so they start to butt heads. And usually what happens is a rep from the union and a rep from the management meet together, and they don't meet by themselves. They meet with a mediator. And that mediator oftentimes is an individual who at one time was a part of the union and then moved up into management. And so the unique distinction between that mediator and the other two groups or individuals in that meeting is that mediator understands what it's like to be in the union, but he also understands what it's like to be in management. And so he speaks both languages, for lack of a better term, and he can help resolve the issues with that. That's the thought behind Jesus coming to this earth in physical form. You could take, God is omniscient, so we don't want to act like God doesn't know anything. But if Jesus had never come to this earth, man would have an argument that they can make. They could look at God and say, you've never experienced temptation, so you don't know what it's like to succumb to the temptations of being in this physical body. And so God, being just and being righteous, sent his Son, God, into this world to be tempted, to experience the same way that we have. Matthew chapter 4, the first 11 chapters talk about Christ being led into the wilderness, and he is tempted. He is tempted by Satan in three separate ways. He's tempted in the first, he's tempted to make stones into bread. That's the lust of the flesh. He's tempted to put himself on top of the temple and cast them off. That's the pride of life. And then he's also tempted to look over all the land and bow down to Satan, and Satan would give everything to him. That's the lust of the eyes. So all the three ways that Jesus was tempted in the wilderness by Satan, we are tempted today. And I think it's a comforting thing to understand that God knows how we feel. And he doesn't know how we feel from an omniscient, knowing everything standpoint. He knows how we feel from an experienced. And how do we relate to people? I worked in the aerospace industry before I moved here. And one thing that I noticed, because I worked with a lot of retired military or veterans, and one thing I noticed is they had a very close bond with each other. A bond that I did not have with them because I never served, but they had, and if you're in the military, you understand what this is like, but they had a bond with each other because they had similar experiences that they experienced that most people have not. And that brings them closer, and that ties their bond. And so the same thing applies to Christ. We have a closeness with Christ because Christ has endured the same things that we have endured, particularly from the temptation standpoint. Another reason Jesus came to this earth was to endure emotion. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7 says about Christ, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. John 11, chapter 11 and verse 35, we have the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept, or he experienced emotion. Luke chapter 22 and verse 44, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as if it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground. In Matthew chapter 9 and verse 36, but when he saw the multitude, he was moved with compassion on them, because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep, having no shepherd. Now, I'll ask a question. I put myself in this group. But have there ever been times, or a time, but in my case times, multiple times, where you have done something from an emotional standpoint that if you were to remove the emotion from the equation, your reaction to that situation would be completely different. Perhaps our emotion, we get angry and we say something that we don't mean to say, or we do something that we did not necessarily intend to do. But because of that emotion, our reaction is different. The same thing can be applied, and we can read throughout the Bible of instances where Jesus was emotional. We read a few where he was in agony. In other words, he was crying. He was feeling emotional sadness. We look at the times that he cleansed the temple of the money changers. He experienced anger. We look at the times that he looked upon the maimed or the hungry or the helpless, and he had the compassion. All things that we can relate to. And when we read those things, it's not difficult for us to understand where Jesus is coming from. We understand what it's like to experience sadness. We understand what it's like to experience anger. We understand what it's like to have compassion. But what's perfect for us, and this goes into our next point, is that when we read about Christ having these feelings of emotion, we can read about the actions that Christ took. In other words, he got angry about the situation in the temple. He did something about it, but at the same time, he didn't go as far as some of us might have gone in a fit of anger. And the point being is that we often hear the phrase, "Oh, my emotions got the best of me." And people don't use that from the standpoint of diagnosing a problem. They use it as an excuse. My emotions got the best. Anyone ever apologize to you and it's not really an apology? Sorry I said that, my emotions got the best of me. Or kind of from that standpoint of, you need to understand where I'm coming from because I had no control over my actions. That's not the case. And we can look at Jesus and we can prove exactly that, because he has gone through the gauntlet of emotions that we face, but he has never acted in a way that has not been to the glory of God. And so to endure emotions, and then finally, like we pointed out, to set an example. God cannot sin, and man cannot avoid sinning. Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, 1 John chapter 1 and verse 8. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. So sin is something that we succumb to, and it's something that God cannot do. So there has to be something in the middle that understands both sides, and that's Jesus. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21 says, "For even hereunto ye are called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow in his steps." Excuse me. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21, it says, "Because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example." The Greek word for that word example is hupogrammos. Hupogrammos is simply a writing aid. So if you're a young child learning to write Greek, or a second-year student here, you have a hupogrammos. You have a pattern. You have something that shows you how those letters are to be written. If you were to go into a kindergarten classroom in our school system today, more than likely you're going to see the alphabet above the blackboard. That's an example of the idea behind this word, hupogrammos. There are two characteristics about this writing aid that apply to Jesus. First is it's complete. You're probably not going to walk into a kindergarten classroom and only see half the alphabet. And if you do, then there's something wrong. More than likely what you're going to see is you're going to see the entire alphabet hanging above the blackboard. The other aspect of it that you're going to find is that every letter is written how it should be written. It's written perfectly. There's no shorthand. There's no chicken scratch. There's no alternative ways of writing it. You're going to see a complete alphabet, and you're going to see that alphabet exactly how it should be. I know when I was growing up, we learned to write cursive, and we had a cursive one. And I'll guarantee you there are letters that I wrote in cursive that look nothing like the thing above the board. And so we apply that to Jesus. We see in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, it says, "For we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but in all points was tempted like we are. So there's that completeness of the temptations of Christ. It says, yet without sin. And there's that perfection that's involved in the hupogrammos as well. And so easy for us to relate to from that standpoint. Numbers chapter 23 and verse 19, God is not man, that he should not lie. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 18, that by two immutable things in which it is impossible for God to lie. But then as we mentioned earlier, Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And 1 John 1 and verse 8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. And so we, even though we are a sinful creature by nature, by this physical nature, we have an example of someone who lived physically here on this earth, yet encountered and approached and dealt with every situation the exact way it should be handled. And we can confidently say that if the roles were reversed, in other words, if God the Son, Jesus, stayed in heaven and God the Father is the one who came down to this earth, that the way Jesus handled temptation and emotion in this world is the exact same way that God the Father would have handled temptation and emotion of this world. And we go to the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, the beginning of the chapter, I believe, and it calls Jesus the image of God. That's the idea of a stamp, I believe. But in other words, we saw God here on earth when we read about the life of Christ. And so, which is a benefit to us. It's something that we should obviously be very thankful for. And then last, but definitely not least, in fact, I would say probably the most important reason for Jesus to come here on earth is to die a physical death. Jesus, or the second member of the Godhead in deistic form, is eternal in nature, cannot die. You look at all the examples, and we'll look at this in a little more detail, but throughout the Old Testament, we see blood is a big part of the forgiveness of sins. Well, God cannot bleed. So there's an aspect of deity that must come down and be able to bleed. We see that the death of Jesus was talked about in prophecy. Isaiah chapter 53, Psalm chapter 22 are great examples of the things that he would suffer when he came to this earth from a physical standpoint. Typology is another example of Christ's incarnation, particularly his death being represented. Exodus chapter 12, before God doles out or punishes the Egyptians with the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn son, he tells the Israelites to offer a Passover lamb and to take the blood, put it on the doorpost of their house, and the angel of death would pass over, and the firstborn in that particular house, in any house that had that blood over the doorstep or the doorpost, would be spared. Those who did not lost their firstborn. And so we see the blood necessary for that. The bronze serpent. The Israelites are in the wilderness. They have an issue with snakes that are biting them. Moses raises a bronze serpent, typical of Jesus being raised upon the cross. It's not difficult for us to see the comparison from the two. And Numbers chapter 21, when they were bitten with the snake, they looked at that bronze serpent on the cross. The same way that if we look to Jesus, looking to Jesus, obviously being entailed of everything that's involved with salvation, but if we look to Jesus on the cross, then we are saved from our sins. The goats in Leviticus chapter 16, on the Day of Atonement, the offering goat and the scapegoat, both are representations of Jesus and his death. The significance we see is in Hebrews chapter 2 verse 14. It says, "For as much then as we are children, are partakers of flesh and blood, he also likewise took part of the same." In other words, he came and he was a physical blood and flesh just as we are. And then it says the reason why, that through death he might destroy him that hath the power of death, that is, the devil. So in other words, Jesus came in a form that can die so that he could be put to death. The intention from the very beginning. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18 and 19, for as much as you know you're not redeemed with corruptible things, such as silver and gold, from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish. And Matthew chapter 20, verse 28, even the Son of Man came not to minister unto, but to minister and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, we're going to go real quick because we're running out of time. Let's look at the incarnation today, the effects that it had today. At some point before Christ came to this world, according to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 6, it says, who being in the form of God, talking about Christ, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. So for lack of a better illustration, if we were to rank the Father and the Son before the incarnation, we would put them on level ground. One's not greater than the other, but one's not lesser than the other either. And again, it's not as simple as that, because rank in heaven and among the Godhead is not the same way that we think about it today, but for illustrative purposes, that's what we're going to use. And then we go on to verse 8, and it says, and he humbled himself and became obedient unto death. So at the incarnation, that rank changed or shifted. In other words, what was once equal, one went below the other one. And we look at everything that Christ says while he's here on this earth. When he prays in the garden, he says of God, if it be thy will, let this cup pass over. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. And I came not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. We see that act of submission among Christ. Now, what's interesting is when we read passages after the ascension of Christ, Colossians chapter 2 and verse 9, for in him dwelleth the fullness of the Godhead bodily. This was written after Christ had ascended, but we see that that word bodily says that he still has this tie to his humanity. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 11, for both he that sanctifieth, talking about Jesus, and they that are sanctified, talking about us, are all of one, for which cause he is not ashamed to call them brethren. Acts chapter 7 verse 56, Stephen is being stoned, and as he's being stoned, he looks up into heaven and he sees the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God. Anytime you see that phrase, Son of Man, applied to Jesus in the Bible, that's a nod to his physical or his human side. What's interesting about that title, Son of Man, is one, it's the one in which Christ refers to himself the most. Two, Christ is the only one who calls himself Son of Man. And what that tells us is that Christ's relationship with us is very special to him. It's very special as far as he's concerned. It kind of puts us to shame, because there are times that I know, speaking for myself, where my relationship with Christ is not treated as special as Christ treated his relationship with me. And then 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5, he's called the man by Christ. The shift, everything that Christ suffered, should give us two things, and we'll close out with this. One, it should illustrate for us the love of God. For everything Christ went through and the reason he went through it should show us how much God cares about us and loves us. Number two, it should show us the severity of sin. The whole purpose of the incarnation was a result of sin. And so if all that was to take place because man sinned, that should show us how serious it is.